Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I've got 6 albums to talk about in short form reviews. And let me just first say there's some household appliances that are on right now making noise. And for a bunch of reasons I just decided I'd film this right now. And thus I decided, you know what, I may as well use this microphone. I'm not sure if I'll be using a mic for other upcoming videos or not. I guess, yeah, I still haven't fully figured that out yet. But I feel like for today it's probably a good idea because it's so noisy right now. So apologies if the sound quality of this is not great, but I think the microphone should help. Anyway, I just want to give a little bit of an update on what's been going on with me recently. Now, without getting into all the details, I have been very busy recently. I actually quit my job recently, and I got a new job, which means I will still be busy with that. But for the last little bit, I've been working 2 jobs at once while I was, switching jobs. I started one before I left the other. And thus, for about a week and a half, I was working 2 jobs at the same time. And yeah, that was not particularly fun. But you know, I've got a little bit more free time now. I will still be quite busy with other stuff. Again, I'm not getting into all the details on what's going on in my personal life, but don't worry, everything's fine. I've just been busy, that's all. And yeah, I wanted to just talk about these albums in short form reviews. I'm not going into a ton of depth on them, and I do have a lot of other videos that I've been trying to hopefully get written and filmed soon. We'll see when I get around to doing that. Quite a few individual album reviews I've been hoping to do, including another throwback review, but we'll see when I get around to doing that. Anyway, though, for now, I want to talk about these albums. I think I've gone on and on and on for long enough at this point. This video is almost 2 minutes long already. So, yeah, without further ado, let's get into the reviews. Lastly, I'm just going to say, as always, it's just my personal opinion on these albums. I'm not trying to be objective or anything like that. Just telling you how I personally feel about these albums. Alright, now that that's all out of the way, let's get right into the reviews, starting off with... So this was a Bandcamp discovery for me, and the genre description seemed intriguing, including alt-country and indie folk, which sounds up my alley, but unfortunately I didn't end up liking this. And I ended up only listening to it all the way through a couple times. I was going to listen more, but then I just got really busy and didn't want to get too far behind on my reviews. I do use that strategy quite often with mini reviews. But the other reason I didn't listen to this a whole lot is because I just don't like it. And it's one of those cases where I want to be able to genuinely praise this because it's by a smaller band and I want to be able to praise albums by lesser known acts. But here I just can't. But okay, you know what? Let's start with the positives. At least the vocals are good. They're not particularly unique, nor do the voices really blend well together, but the singers are good. And I do think they can occasionally find a way to put their strengths to good use on this album, where a song like Raincoat actually kind of nails the vibe that most of this album wishes that it could. But then we get to the production, which often sounds really messy and distracts from the more melancholic vibe that this seems to be aiming for. And it distracts from the vocals as well. I'm talking about all the fuzzy guitars and the drums that sound weirdly mic'd to me. I'm not an expert in music production by any means, but I can tell you whether or not something sounds good to me personally, and a lot of this album doesn't. And then we get to the writing, where not only are the compositions boring the hell out of me, but the lyrical style really isn't my favorite either, and I honestly find it a bit insufferable. Although I do want to put the asterisk that it's not as much bad writing as it is a writing style that I personally don't like. And I also wonder if I might have liked it more had the music itself been different and more fitting for this vibe. Because what I'm talking about is the kind of abstract imagery where it sounds very designed to be open to interpretation in a way that comes off as try-hard, or I guess maybe more like they might not have been trying that hard at all. And there very well could be way more to this than what appears on the surface, so I'll leave it up to you whether or not the lyrics are special. If you're interested in hearing a sad, mellow indie folk album with some fuzzy guitars and a hard-to-untangle story where it seems like the narrator is stuck reminiscing on an old relationship, but there are also potential other meanings, well then it's probably worth giving a shot. I also could be completely wrong about the story being told. Again, I only gave this a couple listens and I didn't take a ton of time to try and piece it all together. But yeah, overall, I would say this has strong Phoebe Bridgers vibes, although I don't think they do nearly as good a job with the unique lyrics as Phoebe does. But it's got that kind of vibe, and I feel like there's another artist this reminds me of a lot, and I can't quite place who it is. But I unfortunately found this to be a bit of a painful listen, and I feel like I didn't even do a great job of fully explaining why. but if you want me to give this an honest rating, I'd say a very light 5 out of 10. Again, if any of this sounds appealing to you, it is probably worth hearing. I can genuinely say there would be a big audience for this if they get more attention and more people knew about them, but I'm absolutely not in that audience, and I think I've made that very clear at this point. I guess it is what it is. Alright, here's a bit of an extra brief one because of my huge time crunch with getting this video out. But here's an album from this group which I'd never heard of before, and I saw it described as neo-psychedelia, post-rock, and ambient. And it seems to have gotten quite a bit of acclaim so far. And unfortunately, I'm not that wowed by it. There's some cool jazzy moments on here, and I can respect a lot of the creativity, but the sort of all-over-the-place vibe doesn't quite feel like it comes together in a way that's greater than the sum of its parts. In fact, it kind of feels like it does the opposite. I do find some of the storytelling kind of interesting with the unease that both characters seem to be feeling with their lack of life direction, but I feel like it still could have been executed in a more complete way that really drives the stories forward to have more impact on the audience. I mean, it just would have made me appreciate this a bit more, but I'm not sure it would have totally saved the album, because I'm just not super impressed by the music here. I quite enjoyed There Was a Nice Sunset, the closing track was kind of cool, and again, I can respect some of the writing, but it just feels like it should be a lot better, and unfortunately I'm left giving this a 6 out of 10. It's decent, but I would not be rushing out of my way to recommend it. Here's another album that I found on Bandcamp, and it's a mostly rock-adjacent album with some flourishes of other genres, where different songs remind me of different artists, including a lot that sound very reminiscent of the Black Keys. And I guess I'll start with the positives, of which there are unfortunately not that many. I like the kind of country groove on Aethernet, despite it being quite simple, because it is pretty effective at being that, and Angel on the Wayside has a pretty catchy guitar riff, even if the mixing on that song sounds really bad. And I also find the lyrical content kind of interesting on Starting Line, about wanting to not go backward in terms of your goals and dreams. But so much of this album just feels bland and uninteresting, the vocals aren't really doing much for me, and the production doesn't really feel like it gives this the punch that it should have. And at points the lyrics can be kind of cringe too. Just look at the opening track as a huge example, where the whole thing is basically just, oh no, I don't have a sugar baby anymore. And with the depressing ending that really just hits a weird tone for me, where the upbeat instrumentation doesn't fit at all, or else the lyrics could have tried to fit the vibe a bit more. That and many other reasons are why this is a light 5 out of 10 for me, and I'd highly recommend you skip over this one. It's just not special if you ask me, and I don't even really see the appeal. I found out about Jesse Wells last year, and one thing I noticed pretty quickly is that he puts out a shit ton of music. And despite my endless praise for Middle, which I still stand by, after hearing apparently his other albums weren't as good, and then listening to one or two of them and not being all that impressed, I pretty quickly lost a lot of my interest in really checking out more of his music. But I decided I may as well give this new album a shot, because why not? And I just can't say I'm all that impressed with this one either. And maybe he is just putting out too much music. Yes, I can respect the ambition, but it often doesn't lead to the highest quality music, and I just don't find Jesse Wells' brand of country music particularly interesting or as novel in the grander scheme of things as he probably thinks it is, even if the execution on Middle made that not a problem for me at all. But the songs here feel a lot weaker, with less standout melodies, and the vocals feel way more passionless, and while I can praise some good hooks on songs like Red, Everything Must Die, and the title track, the production doesn't give this the firepower that I wish it had, even if it's far from awful. And obviously the lyrics are a big part of this album, and I'll be honest and say that because of my huge time crunch, I wasn't able to dive as deeply into the lyrics as I was hoping to. Honestly, that could probably be said about every album in this video. But on the first few glances, it just doesn't seem as interesting or thought-provoking as I think it's intended to come across. And it's also just harder for me to care that much when so much of the music sounds dull and lacking in real impact. So while I can respect a lot of what Jesse is trying to do on this album with pointing out lots of the problems in society and having a mindset of trying to enjoy the good things that we have while also fighting for change, it just feels like something that I've heard before, and this doesn't do a particularly great job of it in my opinion. I don't know, maybe I'm just missing something, but I'm just not feeling emotionally impacted by this or really all that invested in this from a critical perspective. And I guess it's also worth mentioning that another theme of this album is of people hiding behind masks, aka a fake persona to try and gain sympathy or get whatever they want. And it's fascinating and also a horrifying concept at the same time, but it doesn't really feel like Jesse is saying much more on this album other than, hey, look, this is bad, and guess what? It happens a lot. I don't know, that's just kind of the vibe I get from this. And yeah, it's a good point, but it just doesn't make for a compelling album. And with some weirdly rough guitar timbres and the harmonica only sometimes adding as much to the musical vibe as I think it's supposed to, and sometimes some questionable mixing as well. I mean, look, it's got its moments, and some of the commentary is kind of sharp, and I'll give him credit for that. My complaints about this feeling basic and too straightforward only applies to some of this album. I'm just not super impressed by it as a whole. There are still moments, though, like Join Ice. Don't worry, the title is satire, which can be quite potent in the way that it really tries to look at the root cause for why horrible people end up being so horrible, and showing how they didn't take the right path to fix their problems, and instead just made everything worse. Again, there are things I like on this album, so for me it's a fairly strong 6 out of 10, and it's absolutely not terrible or anything, but I'd like to hear him maybe take a bit more time to craft another truly great album, which unfortunately I just don't think this is. I kind of feel like that's not what's going to happen, but whatever, I guess I'll just review the album that we actually got, and I wish this were a lot better. Alright, so with these reviews being a little bit rushed, I want to make my usual acknowledgement that with hip-hop albums, I often struggle to review them as well as I'd like, in large part because of the emphasis on lyrics and also how many lyrics that there are. Now, there are a few hip-hop albums I'd like to discuss soon and actually dive into deeper, but this one's just a mini review, and I'll just say to take this with a grain of salt. But after a handful of listens all the way through, I can't say I'm really a huge fan of this album. And honestly, the lyrics are not really wowing me, although that is the part of this album which I think you should take my opinions with the biggest grain of salt. I mean, I like the thoughtfulness of the writing in certain moments like Aegis and Crux and Ansata, and there is some sort of clever wordplay on this album, and it's not bad writing overall, including some heartbreaking lines about trauma after losing a family member. Also, Belladonna with Earl Sweatshirt is absolutely a highlight on this album. But the record as a whole is just not really intriguing me that much, and while I respect the messages of persevering through challenges and finding your best self, the religious themes don't really resonate with me as a non-religious person, and that's where we get into controversial review territory, where I can acknowledge that it's not a problem with the album, just a reason why it's not personally resonating with me. But the other thing I want to mention is that the instrumentation, or like the instrumentals, just really start to test my patience after a while. One prime example is Residuum, where I almost start to not care that Billy Woods and Elucid are making appearances here because the song is just so obnoxious. And I'm also not a huge fan of the spoken word samples that create interludes between the songs. It just starts to become a bit much for me after a while. So it's not a bad album, and I can acknowledge that it's just not for me. So while I'm giving this a 6 out of 10, and it honestly soured on me more and more with each listen, I can still absolutely recommend this. Again, just not really for me, that's all. Here's a country album I found on Bandcamp by an artist I'd never heard of before, and I do want to explore more music by smaller artists. So I thought I'd give this one a chance, especially because I really like country music. And I could not find lyrics posted for this album, aside from one song, and insert my usual explanation on why I cannot really comment much on the lyrics, even though I can hear them. I often listen to albums that I'm reviewing while I do other things, and it's hard to really analyze the lyrics when they're not written in front of me. Although I will say there are: did we kill enough animals to get us through the winter? Do we hate the sin or love the sinner? But overall, it's hard for me to comment on the lyrics, and a lot of them, from what I can hear, also sound quite generic. But again, I can mainly comment on the music, so speaking of which, yeah, not really much to say here. Some of the melodies are pretty good, and the production is okay, but it's certainly not striking enough to distract from the vocals, which, look, I don't like criticizing vocals. It's one of my least favorite things to criticize in music. But I just can't stand the vocals on this project, and it's kinda hard to explain why. I just find the vocals to be a bit much over such mellow, soft instrumentation. And again, if the compositions and vice versa... yeah, lots of technical difficulties here. So earlier I was just quoting, one of the interesting moments that I was talking about before the camera cut out in the lyrics. But basically what I'm saying here in this part is, if the compositions were a bit more interesting, then I'd be able to look past my issues with the vocals, and vice versa. If I found the vocals better, I might be willing to look past my issues with the compositions a bit more, and then the video just cut out. So yeah, that's what I was trying to say here. But as it is, 5 out of 10, and I hate to say it because, like I said earlier, I want to praise lesser known acts. but I'd rather be honest first and foremost, and while you might end up digging this more than me, I certainly am not impressed. Alright, thank you so much for watching. As always, it's just my personal opinions on these albums. And let me just say, I sometimes feel like maybe I shouldn't be doing these sort of negative or at least not positive reviews on these albums by lesser known acts. But at the end of the day, I feel like, you know, it is potentially giving more people exposure to their albums. I mean, not that a ton of people watch my videos or anything, but still, you know, it makes a little bit more exposure to those albums. And again, I just want to be fair about it and acknowledge that it's just my personal opinion. So that's why I still do these reviews anyway. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all soon with hopefully more individual album reviews, and I'm sure some more mini reviews as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back soon, and I think that's all I got to say for now.